Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on when you are choosing to watch this week's lecture. This is week 2 in the Information Technology Importance in Strategic Planning session. I am taping this a little bit early this week for a variety of reasons. And so the discussion topic questions, I only had one comment or observation as of the time of recording this. And that was really around how this individual came to realize the importance of technology in what they do. I don't know that they would necessarily have said that it was part of their core business, but clearly what they do in terms of technology and its reliance and what it is they do day to day is very vital. And that's the real point to how to think about the demand that technology is placing on general managers, no matter what your industry is that you're in or what the level in the hierarchy of management that you're in. It's really the degree to which technology is affecting and influencing everything that you do, whether it's as a manager, an employee inside the organization, or even as a consumer. And so we'll continue to see how some of these influences evolve over the coming weeks. Today we're going to speak more directly around the organizational aspects of information technology, and then how to think about the competitive or strategic uses of information resources. So with that, let me start out. I wanted to touch on that latter point around this idea of competitive advantage and how information resources can be used for that. I've put in here a very easy to read article about Stitch Fix and their approach. And here's kind of how I would summarize it. They've defined a chief algorithms officer, which is a very interesting role. I think you'll hear a lot about chief data scientists. I think you'll hear a lot about enterprise data warehouses. I think you'll even hear this phrase about a chief analytics officer. Well, really interestingly here, Stitch Fix has defined this algorithms officer role, which says that the value of the role goes beyond just data and analytics crunching to this idea of the job to be done. And if you recall from last week's lecture, that's really how we should think about the consumer when they purchase a product or service from us. It's really, what is the job that they seek to be done with that product or that service or whatever that offering is that we bring to the market. And so it's not just this idea of data and analytics and crunching. It's how do we bring the result of that to an insight and an action where we engage the consumer in a very positive and easy to use experience around their job to be done with your product or your service. Now, this particular role at Stitch Fix was recruited from Netflix, where at Stitch Fix, they've developed an integrated workflow capability. They've layered underneath that machine learning that feeds a recommendation to a stylist. And as I referenced, the stylists could be crowdsourced, not unlike we think about Uber drivers as being crowdsourced, where the stylist then makes this kind of personal touch selection so that really what happens is you have this idea of a personal stylist who's looking out for you. But the technology is a big part of the underpinning that enables that entire process. And what it allows the stylist to do, ideally, is to, and I like to use the phrase, practice at the top of their license, quotes. And that is, as we think about being in an organization and in a particular role, we bring a set of skills to that role. The technology that we employ and use allows us to ideally operate at the top of the license for the role that we're in fact, even perhaps beyond. So if you have a moment, I encourage you to read that because you'll get to see how Stitch Fix is using the combination of people, process, and technology to a competitive advantage. And again, it's not just the technology, it's this integrated workflow and process, but it's also the people, the talent. It's that idea of the personal touch that tweaks the consumer's heartstrings, if you will. So let me talk about briefly this idea of information resources. And you'll see in the textbook it talks about the eras of information resources and the evolution of the corresponding value drivers. And there's a lot packed in here, some of which makes it appear to be pretty black and white, and some of it which is probably, frankly, blurry or fuzzy. So as I sat back and I thought about how to characterize this, I think it really is more a progression of how technology has been employed to solve a problem, and how that problem has shifted over time as a manager faces the challenge of being in a particular industry and working for a specific company or firm. And in the early days, as silly as it sounds, are really not that far back, 40 to 50 years ago, a lot of technology was brought to the forefront more around how to enable delivery mechanisms. It was really mostly about automation, and the value was derived primarily from the application of the machine itself. Whether you needed to process a claim, or you needed to calculate a reorder point, it really was around the value that the technology in the machine, almost in its own isolation, delivered. And then it kind of shifted. And it shifted to this idea of the value wasn't exclusively about the machines. It was the idea of how do we bring machines together? How do we see the value of a machine-based network? And this is where you start to think about this idea of connecting things and bringing things together, whether it was, for instance, in a hospital, how do we bring the radiology system together with the patient management system? It's this idea of machines talking to machines. And again, it's not about the job to be done relative to the product and service offering. It's really how to support more the infrastructure of the job to be done. Then it kind of moves into the 2000s, into this idea of what I'd like to refer to as value of knowledge-based networks. It's this idea that we are bringing things together and we are leveraging knowledge and understanding of one another at a different level. It's not about moving a record from the radiology system to the emergency room or to the care delivery system. It's thinking about how do we leverage the knowledge that's gained from the integration of those. So there's actually information to be had by looking at the way those things work and connect and relate to one another. And the textbook refers to this as ubiquitous intelligence, and it talks about this idea of plenitude, this sense of it's lots of information and how do we share that. And as of late, in the last 7 to 10 years, the shift has been toward what the textbook refers to as this hyperplenitude. And for me, that's the value of social-based networks. And we see how this is permeating up and down all spectrums of our society. It isn't just limited to how we should think about strategic and competitive use of information technology. It also goes toward this idea of how is it influencing how we interact with one another. What is the fabric of the society that we now live in? You see and hear a lot of this and the influence of it even in today's discussions around the political agenda and how disruptive technology has been in terms of the social networks and the underlying social fabric of the country. And so that's a macro view of what today's firms, more in a micro concept, face in terms of how technology is being leveraged in this space of social-based networks where you have influencers. And if you think about it, you see this perhaps most in terms of customer care and how we interact with our consumers any longer, and the influence of social-based networks like Twitter, and how quickly things that heretofore might not have been perceived as issues, or at least not rising to the level of attention of senior management. I participated in a cybersecurity forum in the past few years where a large manufacturer of drugs, was telling the story about how they're dealing with social networks in their firm, and they actually had at one of their production facilities an FBI raid of the facility. And while that was actively going on, there was an employee of the firm who was up in the third floor, looking out over, and was literally tweeting in real time what was happening. So if you think about this, what we just described is a consequence of this progression of information resources from machines to connected machines to this idea of the act of understanding how that operates, produces knowledge, to then how the knowledge of what's happening in those connected environments can be used to raise up and elevate at a social level. So understanding that and understanding how you as an organization, as your firm can take advantage of that, whether it's setting up a social network for the purposes of Crime Watch, or whether it's setting up a social network for the purposes of further engaging, like creating a group of individuals who are living with diabetes and facilitating their interactions so that they engage in their health, leading to improved outcomes. This idea of social networks, this hyperplenitude, is very important and a very significant consideration as we think about how do you create strategic advantage in the world of connected information technology. Now, information resources, I refer to that as of things and knowledge advantages gained. And this is more just to help individuals understand the distinction between an asset and a capability. And so, very simply put, assets are things and capabilities reflect knowledge. Some may say talent is an asset of the organization. Well, that's indeed very accurate, but it's the knowledge that they contain and the way that they employ that knowledge that really creates it more as a capability as opposed to an asset. And so on the asset side, I actually added a third dimension to what is in the textbook. It's this idea of you have repositories, which ideally are 360-degree views around your customer base, your suppliers, your own employees. It's how do we bring information together into a place where it's easily digestible. And the textbook refers to that as a repository. Others may refer to it as data warehouses, but that tends to describe the way in which it's implemented. The idea that you focus on it as a priority and you bring it together is the important aspect. I added solutions because solutions are what bring the value of what exists in the repositories to life. And that's how you interact, and that's how information from the interactions is then garnered and captured in the repositories. And at the end of the day, infrastructure is a very important part because that defines the way in which those solutions are brought to life. Now, that could be network capabilities, it could be boxes where things are running, it could be in the cloud, it could be hybrid between something in a public cloud and something in a private cloud. But the point is, infrastructure is more or less the rails on which solutions ride and solutions capture and act on and bring together information that sits and resides in repositories. Now, capabilities, very important on the technology side, is relationship based. Now, that may seem a little bit odd, but technology doesn't exist without people, and people can't exist without technology. And understanding and managing relationships around the delivery and deployment of technology is really important, as well as understanding what the fundamental job to be done is, and then converting that into here's what the technology can do to help enable the job to be done. And you'll hear more about relationship-based when I speak towards some organizational structure concepts, experiences I've had with that, and perhaps most importantly around culture and the implication that culture can have. Now, clearly, your ability to manage the assets and the resources of the organization that are technical in nature is an important one. And likewise, the sheer technical knowledge is one. Oftentimes, not understanding the distinction from a capabilities perspective in an organization, technology organization, is a challenge. Frequently, individuals who have high technical capabilities are often seen as natural fits for managerial roles in the organization, but a managerial capability is not made by high technical capability. Oftentimes, it involves a deep understanding of the potential for technology, meaning the realm of the possible, but understanding and being able to interact with folks who understand technical capabilities is the important aspect on the managerial side. So what comes with that is a degree of respect. That's very important in a managerial capacity. But very often, your most senior technical individuals do not necessarily make the best managerial folks. So we have to think about those as separate and distinct. Now, what's really important as we start to talk about competitive advantage and the strategic landscape that one needs to consider in order to exist inside, you have to have a framework for talking about it. And the fact of the matter is that no one framework is the best. Much of that has to do with, do they make sense, and do they describe the competitive landscape adequately? But there is no one, and we're going to touch on three: the Porter's 5 competitive forces model, Porter's value chain, and then this third one is this resource-based view, which gets toward looking at IT resources, whether they are assets or capabilities, and understanding where your strengths reside. And this is really more of an inward focus to understand where you are, and then consider that as you look at the marketplace and understand where the gaps exist. So the last one, this resources-based view, is really more a gap analysis. In that regard, I think it has probably more direct value than looking at the competitive forces model and value chain. But as I said, no one is right, and it's whichever one tends to resonate as you apply it that makes sense and adds value. So let me talk about first this idea of how we think about value drivers and the competitive forces that reside those inside of Porter's five levers model. So first of all, you have to think about the competitive force. In the first case, it's really, what is the threat of new entrants? And this is oftentimes measured by what are the barriers to entry. And very often, individuals view technology as a keen barrier to entry. And if you think about this, if you have a very sophisticated capability that serves in the underpinning to deliver the technology experience, think about a Netflix, and think about all that has to exist for Netflix to take the thousands of movies, television shows, and the like, and stream those real time to millions of individuals. And they have to build the endpoints that are able to accommodate the differing bandwidths. You can really quickly think about technology as a barrier to entry there. Not that the technology is unique necessarily, but putting it together in the right way and satisfying that experience, making it easy to use so that it fits the job to be done, can be a differentiator and can raise barriers to entry. Secondly, the bargaining power of buyers, and really this is a function of how easy is it to switch. If it's very easy to switch, that means buyers have optionality. And the way that you maintain competitive advantage there is you have to create some differentiated value in that switch. And so for me, as an example, uh, I use the music library on my iPhone. And for the longest time, I stayed in that space because that's where my music library was. Now, what you'll see is there's been an advance, and Spotify, as an example, now streams. In fact, if you look at how technology has evolved, it's gone from vinyl records to tapes, from vinyl records and tapes to DVDs, then it went to digital versions, MP3s. Ultimately, it went to this idea of streaming. And what's happened now is Spotify has made it much easier for me to switch, and I've been able to capitalize on a lower price, lower cost model. And as a result, Apple's initial strategic position and its dominance there, because of its difficulty in switching, has gone away. And they are under tremendous siege as a consequence of that, their music side of their offering. Then you get to suppliers, and this is where what's the bargaining power of suppliers? And that's characterized by you have few firms. The quality of the input that is offered is crucial, and the volume of purchases is insignificant. So obviously, if you have a capability or an offering that is not easily replicated, it puts the supplier in a much larger bargaining position. And if you want to think about that in the technology space, for years, Microsoft dominated that space. There were few organizations that offered the same kind of capabilities. Microsoft Office, Windows as a platform. And what you see today is, in fact, you see a high degree of switch over to Gmail, the G Suite platform, because it's become equal in its quality of the product, and you can participate very easily, irrespective of the volume of business that you bring. And so Microsoft has had its position eroded because of a new entrant that recognized that it was competing really mostly on the bargaining power of it as a supplier, and it undercut that and created a great deal of optionality in the marketplace as a result. Threat of substitute products, I would tell you that that was probably one of the biggest competitive advantages that Google brought to the table, because it offered the G Suite, which undercut Microsoft Office and their position, driven by their experiences, bargaining power of one of the few, if not the only, companies in the space, sat back and said, we dominate with Office and we're going to manage with Office. And that was its primary attraction. And as a consequence, they didn't make it ubiquitous in the iPad, and their position became eroded because of that, because of the threat of substitute products. And as a consequence, the shift in how they viewed their competitive landscape came primarily with senior leader turn, where you see Ballmer moved out and Satya came in, and Satya infused more of this, how do you compete in this space of a lot of optionality, where there are many suppliers who are offering lower cost alternatives, and they needed to respond, and they've done, and they've actually demonstrated great progress in helping to transform. They have miles to go before they sleep, but I think things are promising under Satya's leadership. And then obviously industrial competition or competitors, it can be high when it's expensive to leave the industry. The growth rate is declining, or products have lost a degree of differentiation. And again, this is a way to understand how you would look at a competitive landscape and how you would think about the ways that you compete, and then most importantly, what are the information technology resources, whether it's the assets or the capabilities that could be brought to bear in that space to create competitive advantage or to anticipate a competitive disadvantage, and how one should think about responding. And again, this is a way of framing out the discussion. It's a way, it's not the only way to do that. And so taking another step in that direction, looking at this idea of the value chain, Porter's value chain, and how do we think about this idea of value. And for me, it's very simple. You either offer a lower price, or because of the value that you differentiate in the marketplace, you have customers who are willing to pay more for that. And so as you think about those, you have these primary and secondary activities of first, what value is created through the product or service, and then what are the things that are underneath that make it possible for those things to exist and to remain coordinated. So again, these are ways of thinking about how you can deliver a differentiated price, or a higher price where people are willing to pay more for the value that they receive. And so competition comes from lowering the cost, whether it's through some form of an activity and thereby increasing your profit, or you add value, people are willing to pay more, and you increase your profit. Now, perhaps one of the most important aspects of this comes from this idea of creating a value system, which is this interconnection of a variety of organizations. And in the title, it's one for all and all for one, and then I put sorta, but then a play on words is this idea of analytics, because understanding the value system and leveraging the technology that connects and enables it, and the exhaust rising from it, and understanding that information and using it to your advantage in the value system is really how you can either differentiate on lower cost or higher value. And so much of the advantage comes from first linking the system, enabling it, and then secondly, understanding how the information that comes off of it as exhaust can be used to create that value, whether it's lower cost or it's higher value experience. And so you'll see that there are these large-scale technologies that have been implemented to support that concept. One of them is a supply chain management software, which frequently creates this network of suppliers who can then create just-in-time manufacturing connections between them, so that as a manufacturer is closing in on hitting a reorder point for a component or a part that is critical to their delivery, they can in real time go to the marketplace, bid the lowest cost provider who can meet their delivery time frames, and then have it delivered. And so it's this idea of gaining insight into the supply chain, its cost points, and connectivity, so that you can have this just in time. You can lower your overall costs. You can lower your construction or manufacturing times. It's really this, how do I think about that as a chain, and not just what's in my direct control, but basically squeeze value out of the system. Enterprise resource planning technologies are broad-based. They look across organizations with the same intent of coordinating activities, whether it's talent and talent scheduling, or equipment ordering or procuring. And then customer relationship management capabilities are what exist outside of the supply chain environment. And the purpose for those is to understand the set of interactions that an individual is having across the organization, so that when you're interacting with someone in one part of an organization or in a different part of an organization, you have a comprehensive view of who they are. Perhaps the simplest example of this is in the banking industry, where they used to have checking systems, savings systems, other mutual fund systems, for instance. And oftentimes, each of those systems had a different view of a customer. And when a customer interacted with the bank, it wasn't clear whether they understood that the person had a savings account or a checking account or a mutual fund account, a brokerage account. So customer relationship management systems are really intended to bring that 360-degree view of the customer together, and at the same time be able to contextualize the interaction so that if the customer is interacting with someone, for instance, they pick up the phone and they're calling in, the customer care specialist who's responding to the individual knows with a high likelihood that the person is calling because they just went to see a physician, or a claim was just processed and they have a question about the claim. And so frequently customer relationship management systems, they're not just about linking. Again, this idea of value systems is about linking, but it's also about leveraging the information that's coming through the system into an analytics space, and then converting those insights into action, which frequently shows up in the form of an improved or a differentiated experience that a customer or consumer has with someone. It allows you to understand what the lifetime value of that person is to the organization and deliver a different experience to them. And you'll see that many organizations are leveraging technology to do this. The Disney Magic Band is a great example that's used to track an individual in terms of what particular places they go within the theme parks, or what hotels they happen to stay with. It's really that thing that uniquely identifies them inside of the Disney world, so that they can understand if a situation arises where they can make a choice on how to interact with that guest in a particular way. They do so based on the information that they've garnered about the person, not just the transaction. Again, this is not customer transaction system. This is about systems of differentiation, not systems of record. And an example of a system of record might be the reservation system. An example of a system of differentiation is, again, it's the Disney band as an example. So I call this the teeter-totter problem. If you think about this and how you focus on low cost or a differentiated value in this world of systems, it can lead one down into this space of incessantly competing, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because you can look at its potential in terms of gaining competitive advantage by exploiting hard to find or valuable resources as your differentiator. But sustaining that can be challenging, especially when you look at how difficult it is to transfer resources, or how immobile they may be. An example of this today is that there are a handful of firms that are starting to compete in what's called the robotic process automation space, which is a machine learning based capability that you install on a user's desktop. And what it does in essence is it watches the actions of the individual, and it uses those actions and the consequent outcome. Recall my conversation from the last lecture about you have inputs and outputs in a program, and traditionally you take your inputs, put it through a program to produce your outputs, and you explicitly develop your program based on a set of requirements that are built around converting inputs to outputs. Instead, what this technology, RPA, robotic process automation, does is it watches what humans do in a work process, and it looks at the outcome of that, and it tries to figure out, given the inputs, what actions are necessary to produce the output. And what it can actually do is it can begin to deliver a level of quality that equals what humans do in the process, and in many cases actually will exceed the level of quality. And so it becomes a mechanism for substituting for the decisioning. So obviously highly automatable tasks that involve lesser sophisticated decisioning are great targets for RPA, but the sophistication of the underlying analytics, the machine learning, creates tremendous potential in terms of higher levels of thought that go into those processes, and therefore improves the automation. The point is, these firms are struggling, as are firms attempting to implement this technology, because the machine learning knowledge, the skill set, is not easily found. And so some companies that were first movers actually have created the advantage because they've consumed larger elements of the marketplace for the skill set. But eventually, demand and training will eliminate that, and then they'll lose that competitive advantage. So the caution is that focusing on sustaining is very useful as long as it's not too difficult or expensive to do so, and it can buy you some time while you're looking for more disruptive approaches to compete. But then again, you have to balance that with the fact that disruption itself is useful, and sustaining may require too much effort and take away from the disruption, and the disruption can have a higher payoff. And so as a consequence, this is why I called it the teeter-totter problem of what to do around sustaining competitive advantage, especially if you look at the different ways you can think about it. From a technology perspective, you can think about what categories of capability can help you do that. Obviously, if you think about developing a particular solution, that can create a barrier for competitors. It may require larger investments. It could be take a while to build, and it could be complicated, but it can create a competitive advantage. Assets and capabilities themselves that are used to create solutions can be barriers, much the same way. And I just described an example where some first movers in the RPA space have taken advantage of the rarity of machine learning skill sets. There could be complementary resources as a barrier. Oftentimes, this is where you hear that the team gets it. You'll hear companies talk about, you can take our technology and you can redeploy it, but it's how we operate it as a management team that gives us that competitive advantage. And then clearly, some firms just get there first, and they become overwhelming in terms of the competitive advantage that they have. Probably an example of this I alluded to is how Microsoft for years sustained that competitive advantage until it failed to recognize the shift into the consumer marketplace, and then it resisted it because of the complementary strategy of Windows as a platform with Microsoft Office, and their refusal to technology enable the consumer devices, which led to an opening for competitors to step in, and that has eroded their footing, Microsoft's footing in the Office space, which was frankly undermined initially with the Android platform OS undermining the Windows platform. At any rate, as you think about it once again, and you think about sustaining competitive advantage, here's a different way to think about how you could categorize those opportunities for advantage. Now, the resources-based view, I talked about this during the introduction, and you can view it in terms of the value that you create or sustainability, and you can self-assess based on whether you're speaking toward an IT asset or an IT capability. And what you want to do is think about what are your opportunities for value creation along these spectrums. Do you have a low opportunity for that, a moderate or a high opportunity? Is it a rarity in terms of that particular asset or capability? Does it exist in other places and in other ways? So clearly, if value creation is high and you have a rarity around that, that may create an opportunity for competitive advantage. And likewise, when you get to sustainability, It gets toward how easily is it imitated, how easy it is to substitute, and how easy it is to transfer from one to the other. So if we take the example of Microsoft Office and Windows, primarily operating in an enterprise class space for years, they had a very high degree of sustainability for their position because there weren't very many imitators that were out there. It wasn't easy to substitute. A lot of work processes, whether they were automated or individual to individual, were built around the use of Microsoft Office tools and applications, whether it's spreadsheets or Word documents or database capabilities. But as I alluded to, they failed to anticipate adequately the shift in the consumer space. Remember the conversation about the consumerization of information technology and the impact it's had on IT strategy for some very staid organizations, and I referenced Microsoft as one of those. It created that opportunity for substitution and then ease of transfer because you'll hear that all of the standard formats are supported. And so now they have to think about how they're going to compete differently. Another example of this in terms of IT capability, where they were challenged in the enterprise space, was Google. Google was very good in the consumer space, and for a number of years it was trying to penetrate deeply into the enterprise space. So it's a little bit of the reverse challenge that Microsoft saw, where it was in the enterprise space and really wasn't clear on how to penetrate consumer space. Well, turnabout's is fair play, and so Google struggled with how to penetrate the enterprise market. And a lot of that had to mostly do with the relationship skill sets. They were not equipped to handle enterprise class technology organizations. They didn't speak the same speak. They didn't have the same cadence and views and perspectives. In essence, there was a cultural mismatch, and large organizations struggled to interact successfully with Google because of that. Google has made some significant strides. I was out there in the last 3 weeks, and I will tell you that they have done a very good job of changing their relationship-based IT capability. They now have individuals who are hand in glove in the interactions with enterprise class IT organizations in a way that they weren't when we were out there 3 or 4 years ago. And that is very promising for them as they're looking to penetrate the cloud and the platform space for and analytics for delivering technology solutions and not just infrastructure. And likely will pose a significant challenge to Amazon Web Services and Azure in that regard. So it's really not all rosy out there. Risks abound for companies that are looking to use information technology as a competitive advantage. One of them is awakening the sleeping giant. And this is a great example where Schwab was a first mover, and then E-Trade came in and dominated. And so don't rule out a large organization with deep pockets. Much like Satya has made a big impact in the Microsoft space, I think we're going to see them become more and more voracious and compete in the consumer market. But again, it's a risk. We'll see how they do. You can have bad timing. I don't know how many of you may even be old enough to recall Apple's Newton, but I was one of the early adopters of the Apple Newton, and it was at the time an interesting concept, but it was not ready yet for adoption for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the biggest one was it just lacked the connectivity that was necessary that make smartphones what they are today in terms of the power. The cloud wasn't there yet. So it was really, I talked earlier about, being contained to the machine or to the device. it was pretty much contained to the device, and that was very limiting in terms of the capability that it offered. And you can just flat out implement IT poorly. Many of you probably recall the Affordable Care Act launch and all of the problems that they had in that. And so failing to implement IT well can be brand damaging. And I think that the example I shared is probably a great example that much of us watched play out in the public eye. Clearly failing to deliver what users want. And sometimes this can, again, go back to the culture of the organization. I use Cisco in their acquisition of Linksys. Again, Cisco, enterprise class IT organization, knows how to talk to the enterprise, saw this expanding market place of connectivity in the home, and saw Linksys as a mechanism to get in. And there were other acquisitions they made, the handheld camera, I forget what it was called, and they just didn't play well, because not unlike the example I gave where Google struggled to, as a consumer-oriented organization, as big as it is, and as corporate-esque as one might consider it, just didn't know how to interact with enterprise class organizations. And likewise, enterprise class organizations that attempt to get into the consumer space and try to deliver products don't really get the consumer. And there's a cultural shift, and it's not an easy one to go through, and that's change. And I'll talk a little more about culture here in a bit. But Cisco openly acknowledged in conversations I've had with John Chambers prior to Chuck Robbins joining, they needed to make a shift. And one of the reasons Chuck is there is to help Cisco understand and move that shift. For them, they decided the consumer space they weren't as ready for it as they thought they were. They doubled down, and it focused on the enterprise. And for them, the move more now culturally is a shift from hardware to software, because anymore hardware can be done in software. You want to think about a simple example of that. You think about GPSs, you think about digital cameras, you think about flashlights. I mean, these things that were hardware-oriented devices now are manifesting themselves on a ubiquitous general purposes platform, and the software is how that hardware, if you will, gets brought to life. And in the IT space, you hear about this through virtualization. I referenced containers and this idea of Docker versus Kubernetes. Well, you'll also hear about things like blockchain, and both blockchain and containers will be game-changing in the information technology space, because both of those are taking elements that exist today and creating higher levels of virtualization of software and the hardware, so to speak. And then clearly, while the book calls it running afoul of the law, a lot of that has to do with not understanding the law, or perhaps getting out ahead of it, or regulatory constraints. The classic example of this is the Sabre system, American Airlines, back many, many years ago, when travel agents were first being connected, where machines were connecting and systems were being brought to the network of travel agents across the country. American Airlines dominated that space. And what they would do is, when it came time to search for routes, they would tend to offer American airline fares routes first. And as anyone knows, if you have to scroll through a set of options and you don't have the ability to easily filter, and back then it wasn't as, remember, ease of use, you found that that technology and approach actually gave American Airlines a competitive advantage, and litigation brought about breaking that up because it was an unfair form of competition. So the bottom line, and this is a linkage back to lecture one, is this idea of co-creating the IT and business strategy. And I call it the general manager, IT manager dilemma, because the general manager needs to be more of a technologist, And technologists need to know more about and be more like general managers, and it's blurring. And this question of, are you in the business of IT, because IT is so much in the business, is a very important one. And it's one where, frankly, at some point, just even the concepts of enterprise class technology, information technology will change, such as what is the role of the chief information officer in organizations in 3 to 5 years. So let's talk a little bit about organization design and sorting it all out. Well, there are different things that influence organizational design. And on the organizational side of that, you have things like decision rights. Who makes which decisions and when and why? You have business processes. Who's the process owner? Who adjudicates a process? Who audits a process? You have formal reporting relationships. Oftentimes, this is tied to concepts of decision making and performance appraisals. And then you have a variety of informal networks which exist in any organization. Just because it's on paper doesn't mean that's what's followed. And I have a favorite saying I use at work, which is, it doesn't matter what the org chart shows as to who is reporting to whom. What's really important in the organization relative to structure is, who do you think you're reporting to? Because that is the basis of elements of the informal network that influence how behaviors are done through the organization, irrespective of the formal reporting structures. There are other things like data. Where is it gathered and collected? Obviously, data is power, information is power, and knowledge and wisdom can be competitive. Where does planning take place? How do you do performance measurement and evaluation? And what are the incentives? And these are things around predicting and then encouraging outcomes. And then lastly are cultural variables. And these are the values, whether they're implicitly held or explicitly stated. And then where does the culture exist? And culture exists within an individual, work units, departments, cross departments, and frankly across geographies, even in the same firm. And aligning those can be an incredibly challenging thing. And as you'll see here in a few minutes, and as I alluded to in the first lecture, culture is the dominant force of organizational strategy that has to be grappled with, irrespective of whether it's a business strategy or an information technology strategy. So, not all structures are the same, and you have ways of categorizing them, and I would posit that in most contemporary organizations, small or large, you actually experience a hybrid of these things, either due to geographies or due to cultural divides or due to divisional boundaries or due to the size of the organization. But in essence, you can be hierarchical, and that's the traditional management chain, if you will. You can be flat. Flat oftentimes is something that's seen in very small organizations and entrepreneurial startups, and that's because you have to be more of a generalist in that space. And what happens is you grow and you become bigger, skill sets need to become highly specialized, processes need to be formalized. As a consequence, accountabilities need to be more structured, and you tend to navigate from flat into more hierarchical. And that pivot can be very challenging for entrepreneurs because there's a sense of bureaucracy is being overlaid. And so this transition from flat to hierarchical can be a big challenge, especially when you think about startups, and very acutely so in technology, because there's always a sense of freedom to act. And as you get into very large organizations, in my particular case, I manage an organization that's in excess of 6,000 information technology resources, and you have to operate under just even a principle of separation of duties because of audit requirements and compliance requirements. And so you, by necessity, cannot operate in a flat organization. And this can be challenging when you acquire startups. And we'll hear more down the road about this idea of the core and the edge and how can you manage and balance one to the other. Matrix is a great way of trying to navigate two objectives or multiple objectives at once. I mentioned the organization I'm responsible for and its size. We actually operate in a matrixed environment where individuals are aligned by traditional responsibilities, whether it's solution engineering or infrastructure management or cybersecurity, but also by business segments. And what you have is you have an accountability that will go up a traditional hierarchical organization, but then you have a structure that manages the commitments to business lines across the organization. And this was an important aspect as the organization in the roughly 18 years that I've been a part of it has grown from an IT organization that was probably somewhere in the 500 or 600 resource space to an order of magnitude larger. And how do you stay and accommodate rates of change at the business level and at the technology level without creating some natural structural tension where you seek the right skilled individuals to manage that. At one point in my career prior to coming here, I had 4 bosses in a matrixed organization, and it's a skill set that not everybody has. And ideally, what you do when you find that is you align the right skill set to the right structural aspect. And then network is a very informal a way to operate, and it tends to be more work group and resource driven and based, and oftentimes is employed in a very, very dynamic and fast move, but larger organizational space. So how do we think about co-creating the structures? And as I alluded to a minute ago, contemporary organizations are doing this through the behavior of the individuals. And you see typically most contemporary organizations are hybrid in nature. Social networks are often one of the most powerful forces in bringing that about. Clearly, culture and underpinnings are there, and social networks are built every day, and technology is used to help identify those. Some of you may be in organizations where you have a Facebook-like capability inside to find individuals who have particular skill sets. A lot of your larger consulting organizations, their lifeblood is built on the platform that manages talent and skill sets so that they can quickly identify a skill set that aligns with the client need and engage them. And so you in order to operate in those agile and adaptive ways, you almost have to break free of some of the traditional structures, hierarchical or other, and you can operate them successfully as long as the elements of the organization are understood in terms of who's accountable for which part, whether it's performance management or other. And so in essence, when you talk about this, this technology as a platform and talent, whether it's information technologists or others, are co-creating these structures. And the reason is this need for flexibility, agility, and adaptiveness that can change to what the job to be done is. And successful organizations have this built in their DNA. It helps them be adaptive and flexible and responsive to a changing customer base. And as I alluded to, technology platforms can make this a lot easier and can help create a greater agility and adaptiveness for organizations that are striving to be adaptive in that hyper-competitive environment. So what about, what does this mean in terms of the co-creation of structures and the way that technology changes what managers do? Well, the traditional things of monitoring how individuals are performing, of evaluating their progress, of providing feedback, creating compensation and reward structures, and the underlying control processes are all tremendously influenced by technology. In fact, technology in and of itself, if you think about managing the technology environment, is doing the same sorts of things. There are very sophisticated analytics tools that gather massive amounts of information that is machine-based, that is then used to understand how technology is interacting and when there's an issue and when there isn't, but also how individuals and work processes are interacting. And not just to understand how a value chain is performing, but how the individuals within the value chain are performing. And this, by the way, is as much affected by culture as it is influencing culture. And I've talked about culture, and basically it's where individuals create this sphere of like-mindedness, and they tend to share values and beliefs, and they tend to be social constructs around which they do it. I alluded to, you may have the same company, you may have the same department or organization within the company, information technology, and they may be literally down the street from one another, and they have cultural differences. So driving technology adoption can be very challenging unless you understand what the culture is and what the differences are and how it's affecting it. And this issue of how managers manage the organization and how technology enables it, creating a high degree of transparency, can be the never-ending battle of good versus evil. Insightful in terms of how the organization is performing, but disruptive in terms of how the culture is engaging and or adopting it. And managers have to really understand where the cultural mindset of the organization that they're managing is in relation to the technology that is being employed in order to do that. My experience is clear objectives, clear transparency around how the technology is being used, and linkages to the incentives themselves are the best way to ensure alignment. So bottom line in this conversation is organizational strategy matters because culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And that is incredibly important to understand as we think about the changing technology landscape, the changing competitive landscape, and your information technology strategy as you are bringing that to life, and what could possibly get in the way, whether it is underestimating your position relative to technology resources and the competition, or your own employee base and the culture that exists and their willingness to adopt or to oppose the introduction of technology. And so ideally through this conversation, you have a better appreciation for how organizational strategy, and in particular culture and competitive forces, will influence how you think about information technology, what the barriers may be to its application or the opportunities. And with that, once again, I'd like to thank you for your attention through this week's lecture. And please don't forget to get online and to the discussion, post questions, comments, or feedback you may have about this lecture. And once again, I will take a look at what's out there prior to making the next week three's lecture. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.